So Max Verstappen won the 2023 Formula One Australian Grand Prix. One roller coaster ride that goddamn race was. Chaotic, messy, whatever you want to call it. Maybe too many red flags, maybe too many safety cars, for sure too many crashes. But yeah, in this video, I'm not here to talk about all of that. The video is about the drivers, and it's about sharing the driver ratings of how each and every driver fared during the Australian Grand Prix weekend. So the key rationale behind the driver ratings is that I rate the entire weekend. I'm not going to rate simply what happened in the race. It's going to be how the driver performed in qualifying as well, because that is also a crucial part. So without further ado, let's not waste any more time. Let's get to the main part of the video. Let's start the driver ratings for the 2023 Formula One Australian Grand Prix. Now we'll follow a reverse order. We'll start from Williams and then make our way up the grid. So first of all, we have Logan Sargent. Now, this weekend was a bit listless for Logan. The American, he wasn't able to get to the kind of level that Alex Albon did in qualifying. Ultimately, it was not a race to remember for him. He didn't really do as well as he possibly did in Jeddah. There is a clear gulf between the two drivers right now, and it does appear that Logan needs some time to get used to the car and Formula One, to how ultimately how he can maximize the talent that he has, because he's not short of talent, not at all, and even his qualifying speed has been very impressive in previous categories. So yeah, I think he needs time. Australian Grand Prix was not the good one for him. I've given him a rating of 5 out of 10 after the kind of weekend that he had. Now talking about Alex Albon, splendid in qualifying, because that was stunning performance, especially if you compare it with how his teammate fared. Finishing inside top 10 in qualifying it's something brilliant, especially if you do it in a Williams. And then he even out qualified Alpine, Haas, all of them. It was not as if he had a miracle of a lap in Q2 that helped him make Q3. He sustained that pace throughout that session, and that was very, very impressive. However, when we move to the race, I think he'll be disappointed and he'll be banging his head on the wall, because he pretty much he ruined his race. There were clearly points on the table, and he just left it at that. That crash, it was a bit of an unforced error. It shouldn't be happening, especially at this level, and especially if points are at stake. So yeah, he might be a bit disappointed with how his weekend ended, and because of that crash, which was it was a bit inexplicable and it shouldn't have happened. So yeah, in my view, he gets a rating of 5 out of 10, because that crash really hurt the team a lot. Now moving to AlphaTauri, first let's take a look at Yuki Tsunoda. Now when we talk about Yuki, what a revelation he has been this season. He has taken over the role of the team leader from Pierre Gasly, because he's clearly leading the march. Nick De Vries cannot keep up with him. And most importantly, Yuki has been punching above the weight of the car far too many times. Now, of course, there is an element of we don't know how good De Vries is, and if Yuki is basically performing at a higher level or De Vries is bad. But what we can see clearly is that AlphaTauri is not a fast car. It's arguably the slowest car on the grid, and even then, Yuki has finished P11 in 2 races, the first 2, and he ultimately, fortunately, scored a point this time around. So yeah, all in all, a very impressive weekend, and he gets an 8 out of 10 in my rating. Next, talking about Nick De Vries, he's no match for Yuki right now. It's clearly obvious that there's a big gulf in performance between the two drivers. It's not as pronounced in qualifying. Qualifying, it's still 1 or 2 tenths, but as we get to the race part, you can clearly see Yuki pulling away, and De Vries not able to have any answer to that. Now there are 2 reasons behind it. First is that De Vries needs more time to get used to life in Formula 1. The second is that Yuki is probably just too good. That could also be the reason. Now, keeping all these things in mind, and also the fact that De Vries is under a lot of pressure right now. Helmut Marko has already said that he needs to start performing. It's not working out for him, and finally the DNF, it was just the cherry on top of a whole pile of shit of a weekend that he had this time around. So yeah, in my view, he only gets a rating of 3 out of 10. Now let's talk about Haas. At Haas, first let's talk about Nico Hülkenberg. And wow, what a weekend from the German. I think he maximized everything. There was A better result was not possible with that car, even if we didn't have the whole red flag shebang. Even if that had not happened, I think he was scoring points. And considering how bad the race pace is for Haas, that was very impressive. Now, what we can also see is that there is clearly a big gulf between Magnussen and Hulkenberg when it comes to qualifying. Now, after the first two races, where it did appear that Hulkenberg had not figured out the racing part of it, his long run pace was not that impressive. At Australia, it did appear that he has finally figured that out as well. And then you take everything into account, that was a splendid weekend. Maybe a podium was possible if they had not called out the red flag at that particular point, because he was P4 and Sainz ultimately got a penalty. But the man does not have any luck when it comes to podiums. It's unfortunate, but that's how it is. In my rating, he gets a 10 out of 10 for the kind of weekend that he had. Now let's talk about Kevin Magnussen. Well, this was a weekend from hell for him because he was completely dominated once again in qualifying by Hulkenberg. That has been happening quite often this season. And then even in the race, he was not able to make the kind of progress. His pace was not comparable to Hulkenberg. And then finally the crash. All in all, it was a bit poor to see how Magnussen had a pretty impressive race in Jeddah. How he could not make much out of the weekend in Australia. In my view, he gets a rating of 3 out of 10, especially for a symbolic weekend that he had this time around. Now let's move to Aston Martin, and first let's take a look at Lance Stroll. Now, first of all, a P4 is his best result of the season. So in that way, yes, kudos to him, good result. But let's be fair, we are just about reaching a point where Lance Stroll, the brave driver, that narrative is slowly starting to change to that of a driver that is not on the level of his teammate and who is arguably not making the most of the car that he has under him. A P4 result looks good on paper, but it's not the reality of situation at Aston because Stroll cannot match Alonso in any which way. There is a huge gulf in performance between the two. More importantly, he was even behind the Ferrari and the Alpine of Carlos Sainz and Pierre Gasly. When that happens, you can say that he's not getting the maximum out of the package. There was also a scenario where Sergio Perez was catching up fast behind, and if ultimately the race had been a bit more straightforward, he would have finished behind Sainz, Gasly, and Sergio Perez. There needs to be questions asked ultimately that whether this is the best lineup that Aston can go ahead with. Ultimately, he is the owner's son, so maybe nothing will happen. But yeah, about time the narrative starts changing from Lance being a brave driver to race with an injury to a driver that is unable to match his teammate and get the most out of the car. In my view, he gets a 6.5 out of 10 for the Australian Grand Prix because there were far too many things that were just not up to the mark. And if the race had been straightforward, the result might not have been as impressive as it looks right now. Now, Fernando Alonso. Yeah, at the end of the day, a third podium in a row, so that is very impressive. I'll be honest, I was secretly hoping, not secretly, I guess I tweeted about it a lot of times, that I hoped Fernando Alonso was going to win the race. He's not won in almost a decade, and him winning a race would have been nice to see. That didn't happen. But in my view, I am going to be slightly critical of Alonso because I feel P2 was possible. He probably left a bit on the table on in qualifying. Both Mercedes out qualifying him. Now a bit of it might be due to their supremacy over a single lap. But if you look at it overall, you can't help but feel that maybe he should have been ahead of Hamilton in the race, especially with the kind of pace that he had. He might be a bit disappointed, not fully because at the end of the day a podium is very good, but he might have certain level of disappointment because maybe a bit more was on the table. In my ratings, I might be a bit harsh, but I'm giving him an 8 out of 10 for the weekend that he had. Now, moving to Alfa Romeo. First, let's take a look at Zhou Guanyu. Impressive that he scored his first points. Yeah, he was a bit lucky that both the Alpines they were knocked out. That helped a lot. But yeah, they still score. He still was able to score points. He was probably the better Alfa Romeo driver all weekend. Suspiciously, something's wrong with how Bottas is driving these days. He's been completely overshadowed. So yeah, in terms of making sure that he keeps his seat, Joe is doing as good as he can. So very impressive. First points, good result. In my rating, he gets a 7 out of 10 for the kind of weekend that he had. Now moving to Valtteri Bottas, and I'm not sure what happened. The qualifying was horrible. He's been consistently off the pace of his teammate for some reason, which I'm not sure about, at least until now. There's something wrong. He's not figured it out. There's something wrong with the car because, in general, Bottas does not get outclassed by Joe this easily. And we've seen how good Joe can be. So we know where his level lies. Something's wrong. Overall, a shambolic weekend, to be honest. A poor one from Bottas, as in my view, he gets a rating of 3 out of 10. Now, moving to McLaren, and first, let's take a look at Oscar Piastri. Now, when we talk about Oscar Piastri, it was overall a decent weekend. Nothing wrong with it. He kept his nose clean at the start, scored his first points. All of these things are quite impressive and quite good. However, it's hard not to look at the glaring disparity between him and Norris this weekend. Norris basically did to Piastri what Norris has been doing to Ricciardo in the last 2 years. That was the kind of gap that the two had. Still, Piastri is a bit young. He needs some time to get used to things, and Jeddah was nice. So maybe he'll improve. At least for Australia, kudos to him to get his first points. And in my view, he gets a rating of 7 out of 10 for the weekend. Now, talking about Lando Norris. Now, what a comeback. After the kind of weekend that he had in Jeddah, where he was out qualified by Piastri and overtaken at the end of the race by him, this is how you make a comeback and this is how you make a statement. He was clearly the better driver over a single lap and he was dragging that McLaren to P13. Very, very impressive on that front. Then, ultimately, if you take a look at how his weekend went, he maximized everything. Even when it came to overtaking Nico Hulkenberg, that was, you can see that the car has too much drag. It does not have the kind of straight line speed that other teams do. So McLaren is losing on that front. But yeah, it was quite obvious that he clinically dispatched Hulkenberg as well as he could have with the kind of tools that he had. Overall, if you look at his weekend, I don't really think I can find too many faults. Arguably, he was the best driver of the weekend, and in my view, he gets a 10 out of 10 for the kind of weekend that he produced. Now let's move to Alpine, and first let's take a look at Esteban Ocon. Now, when we talk about Esteban Ocon's weekend, it was about being unlucky at various stages, and then ultimately it culminated in the huge crash that he had. First, it was him being a bit unlucky in qualifying in Q2, where traffic halted his progress and he could not reach Q3. Then, in the race, the untimed red flag, which ultimately ruined whatever kind of progress he'd made early in the race, that ruined everything because it was him and Gasly, both of them together, and Ocon had made the call to switch to hard tires and go till the end. That happened, that ruined things. He made decent progress, got back into points, but once again, his own teammates, wavering Alpine, completely clattered into him, and that's it. Overall, yeah, in terms of pace, things were fine. He was doing a decent job, but yeah, far too unlucky over a weekend. And in my view, he gets a rating of 7 out of 10. Now let's talk about Gasly because in qualifying he was impressive. He was able to reach Q3. In race he was even more impressive because he kept up with Ferrari and he did it quite well. The Alpine had strong pace this weekend and Gasly showed it quite impressively almost throughout the race. However, in my view, I didn't think in this manner when I first saw the crash. But looking at the replays, if it was not Esteban Ocon that Pierre Gasly took out, he would be looking at a race ban, plain and simple. That was wavered. That was poor racing etiquettes, to be honest. Having a car, you don't veer right at that particular stage when you just come back on track. That was irresponsible from his side, and yeah, it ruined a great result for Alpine completely, and it took both the cars out. So yeah, he'll need to sit back and think what he'd done. And he is very fortunate that it was Ocon he took out because otherwise he was missing Baku for sure. So yeah, in my view, he gets a rating of 6 out of 10, losing points primarily because of the crash and the entire thing that happened after that. Now let's move to Mercedes. And first, let's take a look at Lewis Hamilton. Now, when we talk about Lewis, it was it was a pretty strong weekend from his side because the qualifying was impressive. He did a great job. The overtake on Max, I loved it. I just, I mean, that is something that Max used to do to Lewis a lot of times, and this time Lewis returned the favor. Yeah, Max complained. I don't think there's much to it. It was an okayish overtake. Of course, the rules of engagement have changed, but still, it's fine. Nothing wrong with it. And then ultimately in the race, he was able to maintain P2, kept Alonso behind. Very, very strong race in my view. There is, however, one thing that I cannot ignore. He was not the faster Mercedes driver this weekend. It was George Russell. Lewis was outqualified by Russell easily, a tenth or so. Even in the race, Russell was ahead until the strategy and the red flag and the power unit failure ruined things. If you take all these things into consideration, maybe Lewis would have been the second best driver at Mercedes this weekend. So, yeah, because of that, I give him a rating of 8.5. It could have been more, but you can't ignore the fact that Russell was probably the faster driver at Mercedes this weekend. Now, talking about George Russell. Well, splendid qualifying, front row, splendid race. He was leading it, and the start was very impressive. What could he have been able to achieve in the same car? I'm not sure. A P2 was certainly a possibility. Could he have been able to challenge for the win? He could have been if Mercedes was able to keep Lewis at P2 just behind Russell at that stage, because that would have helped keep Max behind. That was the only way it was possible, but even then, it was a long shot. However, in any which manner, Russell was arguably destined for a strong result. It all got taken away from him with that first the red flag, then the power unit failure. Again, who knows what would have happened if he did not have the PU failure. So, yeah, overall, very, very strong weekend. He could have been the standout driver this weekend because of the way he was driving. But yeah, unlucky. Now, for one, I don't count the luck factor against you when you're scoring points. I don't take that into consideration. That is why, in my view, he gets a 9 out of 10 rating for the Australian Grand Prix. Now, moving on to Ferrari, let's first take a look at Carlos Sainz. Now, overall, it was a decent showing from him. He was the faster Ferrari driver in qualifying. The race was quite impressive as well because he was the one who switched to hard tires early. Then the red flag ruined it for him. But yes, overall, he was destined for a P4 finish, and that's a pretty decent result. He couldn't really challenge the Aston Martin or the Mercedes, but it was still a good recovery drive. The biggest issue for him was what happened with the biggest issue for him was, well, whether he likes it or not, or he calls it a disgrace, the penalty was justified. And at the same time, I think it's safe to say that yes, other drivers should also have got a penalty. There were quite a few that had wavered incidents in that particular period, but Sainz also did, and him getting a 5-second penalty, yes, it drops him out of points, but it's justified. He didn't really, in all fairness, he should have been more careful. And yes, first lap incidents happen. It happened in the red flag restart as well, but you have to be more careful. He wasn't, and he lost out because of that. Because of this, ultimately for the Australian GP weekend, I give him a rating of 5 out of 10. Now, talking about Charles Leclerc, what a symbolic weekend. He was off the boil pretty much throughout the entirety of the Albert Park weekend, wasn't he? First in qualifying, he was not as comfortable as Sainz. He was a slower Ferrari driver. Even though if we keep the last lap shenanigans aside, he was the slower driver. Then you talk about the race, and that was a foolish incident. It shouldn't have happened. Entirely his fault, and yeah, 0 points for it at the end of the day. He's dropping his shoulders a bit. It seems like that at Ferrari. He knows the title is out of contention. He again sees the team regressing instead of progressing. And when you see that, your shoulders drop. Leclerc is he's not he's not in the best of mindsets right now, at least in my view. So yeah, let's see what happens next. For the Australian Grand Prix weekend, he gets a rating of 3 out of 10. Now moving on to Red Bull, first let's take a look at Sergio Perez. And in all fairness, his weekend was decided by how he pretty much ruined his own race weekend in qualifying. The car was probably not up to the mark. Safe to say that there is some doubt about what happened there. Something was not right with that crash. Having said that, you should be more careful. You should not be pushing on the very first lap when you are not comfortable with your car. Even Max was not pushing as much. So yes, there is a lesson to be learned, and it's probably something I do feel that he took the title challenge pressure to his head. Sergio Perez, I think he did, and that played a role. So yeah, a P5 recovery, it's good. He did well in the race, but he should have been either P2 or winning the race with the kind of car that he had. So yeah, a disappointing weekend, and he gets a rating of 6 out of 10 for the Australian Grand Prix. Now talking about Max Verstappen, yeah, he did what was needed to be done. He secured pole position, did it very well in the end. He won the race. He overcame quite a few obstacles. First, being jumped at the start by both the Mercedes drivers. Then the red flags, the restarts, he nailed them. Those were pressure moments, and he was still able to keep his head, keep things right, and get the job done. So yeah, it was him, Max doing Max things, to be honest. Was it the best weekend that he's had? No. The error in the final sector, if he was in a close battle, he would have lost the lead and he would have lost significantly. So yeah, not the perfect weekend in my view. And he gets a 9 out of 10 after and he gets a 9 out of 10 for the Australian Grand Prix weekend. Now let's take a look at how the drivers rank after the first 3 races. Now this is the cumulative ratings after the first 3 races. If you want to check the ratings for the first 2 races, I'll just add the tweet where I had mentioned it in my social media. I'll add the tweet in the description. But yeah, the cumulative rating after the first 3 races. Let's take a look at how the drivers rank. So at the top of the standings we have Max Verstappen, P1, Fernando Alonso is second, George Russell is third, Yuki Tsunoda is fourth, very impressive. Sergio Perez is fifth, Lewis Hamilton sixth, Lance Stroll seventh, Esteban Ocon eighth, Nico Hülkenberg ninth, Norris in 10th, Gasly 11th, Piastri in 12th, and so on. So what we can see here is that notably drivers like Charles Leclerc, he's in P14, Carlos Sainz in P16, Valtteri Bottas is last, he's in 20th. So these are the notable exceptions. Also Lance Stroll overall, he's currently at P7, which is very impressive. So yeah, this is the final cumulative ratings. Do take a look. Do share what your views are. Of course, at the end of the day, they are all a bit subjective. And yeah, whatever your views are, how you will rate, let me know in the comment section. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time. I really hope you liked it. Do share the video with your friends, like it, subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching and see you next time.